Okay, so as I mentioned, I recently moved to Golden, and I was really excited when Maura invited me to come and lecture on 50 years of American art history, and then think about the connections to the 50-year anniversary of the Foothills Art Center. Now, as I was originally kind of thinking about my talk, I was like, I'm going to go through each decade and talk about the different movements, but as I was starting to put together my ideas, I started thinking that it would probably we would be better served to think about themes. And this quote really inspired me to do that as I was kind of thinking about what I would say today. And I think this is a really important quote for us to kind of keep in the back of our minds as we're talking about the contemporary art that we'll be talking about today, and I'll just read it out loud. It says, the implicit underlying subject matter of modern art is always the personality of the artist in its encounter with the world, the often painful intersection of psychological forces, intellect, society, and events. Brushwork, line, composition, even representational matter constitute metaphors for the artist's experience of events, both internal and external. So, as I was talking just a moment ago with one of you, we were talking about how art really gives us this kind of personal window into how artists are experiencing events in time, and it gives us this window into their personal experience. So I think that's one of the really exciting things about art history, is we get this opportunity to see how people are experiencing the world. And Jonathan Feinberg, who wrote this quote, he thinks that kind of it's almost an oversimplification of kind of simplifying modern art into these movements. So I will talk about different movements. I will comment on minimalism or pop art, but I really want to focus on these themes that artists are touching on and how they're exploring them in their own kind of individual ways. So some of the themes that I will touch on today are how artists are using materials. And, kind of they're using materials in new ways, how they're addressing popular culture, how they're using art to comment on social issues. We'll also be looking at how artists are thinking about the location of art. Does art just have to be on the walls of an art gallery or a museum, or can it move beyond those walls? And then I'll end on looking at the past, and how artists are looking back to the past as a way to comment on the present. So I know we have just 1 order or 1 hour, so we have kind of, a tall order to get through all of this, but I will try my best. Now, the Foothills Art Center, we're sitting in this wonderful space, was established 50 years ago in 1968. And it's really fostered artists and exhibitions over the past 50 years that reflect some of these themes that I will be touching on today. Now, when the Foothills Art Center was established, it was established by a group of watercolorists, and they were looking for a space to exhibit their annual show. And the Golden Unitarian Church was moving out, and this watercolor group signed a lease on the space. Now, the first exhibition that was held at the Foothills Art Center was Bill and Dorothy Harmson's Western Americana collection. And I got really fascinated with this. It was really interesting to me, first as a kind of new resident of Golden, and I wanted to find a little bit more about it. And I happened to be at the Denver Art Museum a few weeks ago, and there was actually, and I wasn't even looking for it, but there was a catalog on the Harmson's collection of Western art. So I'm going to pass it around if anybody, it's a little side note. So probably many of you know this as Golden residents, but I was really interested in this. So the Harmsons were a well-known family in Golden. They had a candy shop called the Jolly Rancher under the Golden Arch. It was a very popular candy shop, and they were the creators of the Jolly Rancher candy, that little hard candy. And so they began collecting Western art in the late 1960s. Artists like Frederick Remington, George Catlin, Robert Henri, works of art that showed Western America. Now, there are a couple reasons why they were collecting this. One, and they talked about this, they said it was relatively inexpensive at the time. And the Harmsons' interest in Western art also reflected their kind of marketing motifs for their company. So here you can see the package for their Jolly Ranchers chocolates, and it has the Wild West cowboy, and an Indian on the side. On the right-hand side, they would publish newsletters for their candy company, and they would include images from their Western art collection on the candy on the newsletter. So it reflects this kind of marketing motif, this kind of interest in the West. And it also spoke to the location of their candy factory in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And it gives this kind of idealized, romanticized view of the West, kind of looking to the past, looking to the good old days, envisioning this simpler time. Now, it's interesting, when they were putting together this collection of Western art, this is in the 1960s. It was a very tumultuous time in American history. JFK had been assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. The Vietnam War was taking place. The first man on the moon. So there's this idea of kind of looking to the past as this great time, kind of embracing that romanticized view. So while this first Foothills Art Center exhibition was looking to the past, many of their programs and artists that they have supported and exhibitions have also focused on contemporary artists and kind of looking to the future as well. Now, before I move on to looking at art over the past 50 years, it's important to kind of step back a little bit and look at art produced in the years kind of prior to the 1960s. And think about this kind of seismic shift that happened in the art world. No, it's fine. That happened in the 1950s that really kind of shaped and impacted how art history was written in the second half of the 20th century. And it also shapes the kind of multifaceted approach that artists take in the second half of the 20th century. So I want to start with a little story. So in 1948, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City acquired Christina's World, the painting you see on the left-hand side. This is by Andrew Wyeth. And it acquired it for the sum of $1,800, which at the time in 1948 was a quite large sum for a painting. And it was really celebrated as this kind of great American painting showing the reality of rural America. And Wyeth really enjoyed great commercial success throughout his career. Now, later that same year, in 1948, Life magazine ran an article showcasing Jackson Pollock, who was creating paintings that were the extreme opposite of Wyeth's paintings. And if you can see in the article, the title, Jackson Pollock, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? So here we have these two poles, this highly realistic painting on one side, and then Jackson Pollock, which is the complete opposite. It is completely abstract. There's kind of no representation. It is a focus on the materials. And so the question is, and then let me go back. So, and if you've been to the Museum of Modern Art recently, it's interesting to see where Pollock's work and Wyeth's work are hung in the museum in relationship to each other, and it tells us something about art history. So Wyeth's painting is located in a kind of out of the way hallway near some elevators. While Pollock's paintings are in the kind of central galleries, they're central to the history of art, even though these two paintings were being created at the same time. So why do I bring up this comparison? Because it really illustrates a key moment in American art history after World War II. As I mentioned, Wyeth enjoyed great commercial success throughout his career. People liked his realism. He was showing, rural America. But his style remained constant throughout his career. He never changed. He never responded to these more kind of abstract styles. While Pollock burst onto the scene after World War II with a completely new style that he saw as kind of representing this post-war world, this new world that they were living in after World War II. And he was doing something completely different. So his canvases are usually quite large, and in order to paint them, he approached them in a completely new way. He would put his canvases on the floor and would use paints that he would buy at the hardware store. So acrylic paints and enamels, and sometimes he would mix in sand to make them more viscous or add broken glass. And he was a smoker. Sometimes as he was smoking his paintings, the cigarette butts would fall into the paintings, and that was okay. That was part of the process. And the process of actually getting the paint from the containers to the canvas, he did this in a completely new way as well. He used sticks, the ends of his brushes, the can itself, but he was never actually touching his brush to the canvas. He would splatter and fling the paint onto the canvas and pour it onto the canvas. So the process of painting becomes very expressive, and the painting itself is almost this kind of record of that process. Now, the work of Pollock was championed by an art critic named Clement Greenberg, and he argued and really embraced Pollock's work because he saw Pollock's work as reflecting this progression of painting from this illusion of a three-dimensional world that you can see in Christina's world, and this had been the tradition since the Renaissance, to emphasizing the materiality of paint. And so Pollock's painting, he's emphasizing the liquid form of the paint as it falls onto the canvas. And so, Pollock, in Greenberg's eyes, was, focusing on the materials rather than this kind of content of the painting and representation. And in post-war America, Pollock's work was championed as a reflection of this kind of democratic ideals of the freedom of America. So artists had choices in what they could make. Whereas in the Soviet Union, in communist countries, artists were controlled, and they really relied on realist traditions in literature and art. So again, I just use this as a backdrop and kind of showing how art history is written. Wyeth, his paintings were popular and continue to be bought. You can find them in museums all over the world. But the way art history is written, there's this kind of championing of these artists kind of trying new things and exploring and pushing the boundaries. So the first theme that I wanted to talk to really kind of builds on what Pollock was doing and this focus on materials. So we'll be looking at how artists are challenging the traditional materials of art and how these materials are manipulated. We'll also be talking about the role of the viewer in the manipulation of the artistic medium. We'll be looking at new technologies and how artists are embracing them, and how materials can become a metaphor for the ideas that artists are trying to express. So here we have two artists, Helen Frankenthaler, who we see on the left-hand side. And she really built on the ideas of Clement Greenberg, who was really focusing on the purity of art and accepting the limitations of a medium. So she was working in paint, and she was taking the ideas of the abstract expressionists, and that was the group, the kind of movement that Jackson Pollock was part of, but she's pushing it even farther, and she's exploring the materiality of paint, but she's taking it to an extreme. So what Helen Frankenthaler was doing, she would take unprimed canvas and pour thinned paint onto it. So the unprimed canvas allowed that paint to really soak in. So it results in a very kind of very literal flatness versus Pollock's paintings that actually do have a kind of texture to them because of all those layers of paint. Additionally, she does away with the kind of physical, gestural expression that's seen in the abstract expressionists. They were kind of expressing those inner emotions in an abstract way. But she wanted to do that. Her focus was on the materials of the paint, how that liquid paint soaks into the canvas. And I'll just read you a quote from Frankenthaler. Her paintings, she did not want her paintings to be anything more or less than what she painted. She said, if you have bands of blue, green, and pink, the mind doesn't think sky, grass, and flesh. These are colors, and the question is what they are doing with themselves and with each other. Sentiment and nuance are being squeezed out. So again, she's focusing on those materials, the color, the colored paints interacting with each other on that unprimed surface. Now, Donald Judd, who we see on the right-hand side, was also kind of pushing those extremes or those ideas of Clement Greenberg to an extreme as well. And unlike Frankenthaler, he is a sculptor, so he's working in 3 dimensions. And he's working with the materials of sculpture, 3 dimensions. And how he can make that kind of as pure as possible, kind of eliminate emotion from his works. So Donald Judd is often associated with minimalism. And with minimalist artists, they're very interested in these kind of very regular, measured geometric forms. So here we have these 3-dimensional boxes. They're all the same measurements. And we see them in this modular sequence. So the same size box is repeated 10 times with the same amount of space in between each box. Now he's using industrial materials. So he's using pink-tinted plexiglass with steel brackets around them. And he's not trying to disguise that he's using industrial materials. He's making that clear. And the use of industrial materials allows him to kind of eradicate his hand even further. So there's no kind of personal expression. Now using the plexiglass, he makes these boxes see-through. So as a viewer, we can see exactly, what is inside of them. There's no visual ambiguity. There's no kind of sense of deception. We can see, what you see is what you get. He's thinking about that. He's also thinking about, since this is a 3-dimensional sculpture, how this impacts the space of the viewer. This projects out into our space. We walk around it. So how does that impact the environment that it's part of? Now, this focus on the materiality of this really kind of leaves out emotion. This is not a vehicle to explore or express kind of emotions. It's very cool and detached and very objective. And artists responded to that and felt that, minimalism had really kind of gone to its extreme. There was only so far you could push art in exploring the kind of formal qualities. So we see artists beginning to incorporate content, incorporate emotion into their works of art. Now, the next artist that I wanted to bring up, who was really kind of using materials in new ways, is the Cuban-born Felix Gonzalez Torres. And his forms are very simple. They may recall these kind of minimalist forms, but he's doing something very different with his materials. So this is called Untitled Portrait of Ross in LA, and it's an unconventional kind of portrait. You typically think of a portrait as an image of an individual, but this is this kind of unconventional portrait. And so it's a portrait of his partner who had died of the AIDS epidemic. And he begins with the stack of multicolored candies. And Gonzalez Torres, in many of his works, he uses everyday materials, whether it be stacks of papers. He has another work where he bought 2 clocks at a hardware store, and he placed them on a wall. Here he's using these individually wrapped candies. And he starts out with 175 pounds of candy, which was the healthy weight of Ross, who was his partner. And he asked the viewer to be a participant in this work of art. So typically an artwork is behind, a glass vitrine, or there's a certain distance you're supposed to stay. But here he brings the viewer in and asks them to complete the work of art by taking away the candy. So slowly, as viewers take away the candy, the pile of candy dwindles. And he's bringing that viewer into that experience that he had, that very personal experience of watching his loved one die of AIDS and his body dwindling away because of this disease. So even though he's using this very kind of visually appealing, very, multi-sensory material, he brings very serious issues that were affecting the United States and the world at the time, as well as his own kind of personal grief and loss. So he's combining those two through this. And the material, the candy that he uses, becomes a kind of metaphor for these ideas. Another artist, Janine Antoni, also is using non-traditional materials. Here she creates 2 portraits of herself, self-portraits, out of chocolate and soap. And these are called Lick and Lather. And so Janine Antoni is using her own body as the subject of these sculptures, and then she uses her body to transform them even further. So she created these 2 busts, and she created a mold of her head and shoulders, and then filled one with chocolate and one with soap. Now, these are very traditional portraits. They look similar to what you would see in, classical sculpture. Portraits of, and portraits like that typically speak to power, to an individual wanting their image to be remembered for posterity. And what are the materials they're typically using for traditional portraits? Bronze, stone, marble, stuff that's going to last a long time. Chocolate and soap, it's a very ephemeral material. It's not going to last a long time. So she's using these ephemeral materials. And so she has these busts, these molds that she's made, and she re-sculpts them. So with the chocolate, she licked the chocolate, and you can see she's licked over the nose, she's licked over the ear, and the hair. And with the soap, you can notice how it's worn down, almost like a sculpture that's been left out in the weather. And she bathed with the sculpture, so washed it down in the way that you have a bar of soap, and it deteriorates as you wash it in the soap. But these are very kind of intimate kind of actions that she has with these two portraits of herself to re-sculpt them. And she was thinking about, this relationship she has with her image, and thinking about the image that you represent to yourself and being comfortable with that. And she was part of a group of artists in the 1990s who were really interested in returning to the body, especially women artists, and kind of approaching the female body, and this idea of controlling how we're seen, and using the body and this kind of control of her own body and her own image. So this is a kind of disconcerting image, but we see artists also kind of doing away with the materials of art altogether, and using their own bodies as a kind of subject themselves. So they're not using either traditional or non-traditional materials, but it's kind of the idea behind it that becomes the subject of the work of art. So Chris Bearden was known for his performance art pieces. And so, he's taking away that traditional stationary artwork and replacing it with movement and gesture and sound. Now, in this piece, it's called Shoot, he asked a friend to shoot him. And the plan was that he would shoot him from a distance of 15 feet and just nick his arm. But the shooter was slightly off and off target, and the bullet ended up going through his arm. So with performance pieces, there's this element of chance. They have a plan, but things can go awry, and that's kind of part of the piece. Now, what's interesting is this, and Bearden was thinking about this, was this idea of the role of the viewer. So this happened in a gallery. This performance happened in a gallery in California. And he's thinking about, how the viewer reacts. So this was performed in the 1970s. The Vietnam War was on TV. There were protests against the Vietnam War. People were getting shot, but you're watching this from the kind of comfort of your home, from a distance, from this safe distance. But here, those people watching this in the art gallery here where this took place were confronted with violence kind of right in front of their faces. So he's thinking about sensitizing people to violence that had become less and less shocking due to its prevalence in the news. And Bearden was also, this was early on in his career, he was interested in kind of challenging himself as an artist and his dedication to his art. And he said that one of the reasons why he performed Shoot was so he could be taken seriously as an artist. And one of the limitations of performance art is that it happens once. It happens one time, and we have a record of it through photographs. There's also a video of it, but it happens one time. So there's not this kind of, you don't have this piece that lives on. The final work that I wanted to talk about with materials was this video installation by Nam June Paik, who was a Korean-born artist working in the U.S. And with the increased availability of video cameras, artists began to embrace this as a new kind of medium. Some of them use them to record performance pieces or installations, but artists like Nam June Paik saw it as a new possibility, a new artistic medium that he could manipulate. And one of the things about video that was appealing to artists like Paik was that it allowed him to incorporate the element of time into his works. So in this, Fin de siècle, he creates this massive installation. So you can see 201 television sets, all stacked on top of each other. So it creates this kind of immersive environment where you're confronted with this head, this massive head that takes up multiple screens. There's smaller screens. Some of them include David Bowie. There's a couple dancing. There's piano keys. And then he has this kind of blaring soundtrack behind it. And this is a very different kind of experience than simply watching TV. When you're watching TV, there is a beginning and end to the show that you're watching. But here, you're enveloped by all these screens, and he's manipulated the sounds and the images. And so you're enveloped by the screen, and you just kind of see snippets of the installation. So we've talked a little bit about how artists were using materials in new ways and taking them in new directions. Next, I wanted to talk about how artists are responding to popular culture. So thinking about how artists are incorporating popular culture and mass media into their art, how they're appropriating, using that visual language and techniques of advertising to comment on consumerism that they saw, and also this idea of celebrity. So this is a work, one of the reasons I brought this in, this is from the Dallas Museum of Art where I used to work, so it's an old friend. But this is by Romare Bearden. And Bearden was creating these collages where he was using different kinds of materials. He'd use paper and fabric and cutouts from magazines and newspapers and incorporate them into these collages. And this image that he's created is of these three musicians playing their music on a porch, and he was often inspired by things that he saw. So he grew up in Pittsburgh, and so this may have been, a memory he had of growing up in Pittsburgh and seeing people play music on the front porch. But he also wanted to redefine imagery and incorporate the experience of African Americans as an African American himself. Now, not only is he showing these musicians, but this kind of multifaceted application of these different materials reflects kind of the variety of scales that one might hear in jazz music. And jazz music originated with slave communities, and so this kind of connection to jazz really celebrates these contributions of African Americans. And it's interesting, Wynton Marsalis actually asked Romare Bearden to design one of the album covers for his jazz albums. So another thing that this does, in using kind of this patchwork of materials, the kind of random materials that almost look like a kind of quilt, it suggests slave crafts, where when slaves were creating things, they had to use what they had on hand. And he also references this kind of African past as well. He would often incorporate African masks into his pieces, and that right-hand side of that face incorporates part of an African mask that he had placed in his collage. Now, not only was he looking back and incorporating this kind of African American experience, but he was also a trained artist and very knowledgeable in kind of modernist styles, and was influenced by Pablo Picasso, who had incorporated collage into his own artwork. But he wanted to make collage something that spoke to African American experience. Now, Bearden was not necessarily using his images as protest images, but some artists, oops. Oh. Sorry. So another artist who was also using popular culture was Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol came to the art world from a background in commercial art and advertising. And he was very knowledgeable in what made advertising work and mass media. And he used that in his own artwork. So on the left-hand side, we have green Coca-Cola bottles, and we have these Coca-Cola bottles repeated over and over and over again. And the Coca-Cola bottle is this kind of icon of mass-produced consumer culture. And no matter where you are in the U.S., and basically the world even, you can buy a Coke and you know what you're getting. And Warhol commented on this idea of the kind of wide accessibility of Coke. Warhol said, you can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you too can drink Coke. This kind of sounds like an ad, doesn't it? A Coke is a Coke, and no matter what amount of money you spend, no amount of money can get you a better Coke. So he's thinking about this kind of wide accessibility of Coke, and he's reproducing it over and over and over again in the way it rolls off the factory line. He's also using the silkscreen technique, which was a kind of used in the mass production of images to produce these images endlessly over and over again. And it's interesting, you know, he was so immersed in this idea of consumer culture, he called his studio the factory. Now, Warhol was also fascinated with this idea of celebrity. And here we have his work called Marilyn Diptych. And so we see the movie star, Marilyn Monroe, treated no differently than a can of Coke. Here she's repeated over and over again. So this person, this human being, becomes kind of packaged as a commodity for viewers to you know, kind of consume. And again, he's using this the silkscreen technique to reproduce her image over and over again. And it's through, you know, this repetition of her imagery that we think we know her. We see her all over the place. We see her in magazines, in the movies, in the newspaper. But he kind of questions, do we know her? And he shows her on the left-hand side with this kind of, you know, bright blonde hair, garish makeup, this kind of image, this public image that she is shown with. And then on the right-hand side, we see her in black and white. This is Norma Jean, the kind of real person behind this mask. And if you notice, the Norma Jean side seems to kind of fade away. So she's being replaced by that Marilyn Monroe. Now, if you'll notice, the title is Marilyn Diptych. A diptych is typically used as a religious image to honor saints and used in a devotional setting. But here, it's used to kind of, here Marilyn replaces this religious figure, and it's kind of this cult of celebrity. She's this movie goddess. And it's interesting, this was produced right after she had died, so her image was seen, again, even more so at that time, and this idea that she had died kind of elevated her to this even more kind of godlike status. Now, the next artist, Jeff Koons, was also kind of looking at popular imagery. And Koons is interesting. He was trained as an artist at the Art Institute of Chicago. I was just talking with somebody about that. And he trained there, but then went to New York and took on a job as a commodities trader after art school. And he said that this job that allowed him to make a lot of money freed him to explore the themes that he wanted to explore. So he didn't have to be beholden to, the interests of galleries and museums. And he really used his business knowledge to explore and market himself as an artist and the objects that he created. So this work that we see on the left-hand side is called Michael Jackson and Bubbles. That was his pet monkey. And so in the 1980s, Michael Jackson was really at the kind of height of his fame. He was making millions, appearing in music videos, creating hit albums. He was in movies and ads. And Koons actually admired him. He remarked that if he could be one other living person, it would probably be Michael Jackson. And so this sculpture that he made was based on a publicity photograph of Michael Jackson. And it almost elevates Michael Jackson, again, to this kind of godlike status. He's painted in gold. There's flowers strewn around him. The way that he holds bubbles is very similar to Michelangelo's Pietà. But here, it's not this kind of mourning image, but it's this celebration of Michael Jackson's fame. Now, this was created in part of a series called the Banality series. And Koons saw this as a challenge that modern art has to be difficult and hard to understand. So he's taking one of the best-known pop figures that everybody recognizes, and then copies a publicity photo that had been circulated widely. So it would be very hard to walk into a museum and be like, I haven't seen this image before. Many would kind of recognize him. Now this is a life-size sculpture, so it's quite large, and it's made out of porcelain. So when you think of porcelain, you usually think of dainty little objects, kind of kitsch objects, not these kind of fine art objects. So he's taking this material, typically reserved for non-fine art objects, and enlarging it. And Koons doesn't actually craft these pieces. He hired German and Italian workshops that were known for their porcelain production to create this. So he comes with the idea and then passes on his idea to these workshops. And then he made 3 editions. So there's 3 versions of this, and it allowed him to show it at different venues at the same time and allowed for this kind of idea of market saturation. So he's really, trying to get this image out there, trying to get as many people in front of it as possible. And Koons really embraced this idea of marketing. He created a series of ads that promoted him as a persona. And Koons was really interested in this idea of, creating, this kind of persona for people. So these promoted his persona, his gallery exhibitions, and he placed them in major art journals. And indeed, Koons has really appealed to the art market. One of his sculptures recently sold for $5.6 million at Sotheby's. The Whitney recently held a retrospective of his work as well. Now, moving on from these kind of these artists who are approaching or looking at consumer culture and popular culture, I wanted to look at artists who are addressing social issues, major social issues, and using their art as a means to express their opinions and even change people's minds. So the artist Faith Ringgold, who we see on the right-hand side, this is her painting, The Flag is Bleeding. And Faith Ringgold is an African-American woman, and she really wanted to make art that spoke directly to the issues of racism that she was experiencing at the time. And again, she's living during the 1960s. Race relations were a crucial topic. The Civil Rights Act had passed in 1964, but even though that banned discrimination in housing and employment, racism didn't disappear, and it's something that we continue to deal with today. And so she wanted to confront this issue head on and wanted to use her art as a means of communication about the things that she saw. So she was inspired by this painting that we see on the left-hand side. This is called by Jasper Johns. It's called Flag. And Johns was associated with pop art, like Andy Warhol. And he wanted to take images that are seen but not looked at. Those are his words. So an American flag, we see it all the time, but do we stop and think about what it means? So by painting it, he was using this technique called encaustic, where it's pigment mixed with wax and it kind of dripped down and you can see those drips. He's drawing our attention to this flag. But Ringgold was inspired by it, but she didn't feel that it reflected the struggle for racial freedom that really, divided the U.S. So she plays on these drips that are in John's flags and really kind of brings them to life and enlarges them in her painting on the right-hand side. And behind that, behind the stripes and the stars of the flag, she includes these three figures. This kind of small woman in the middle, an African-American on the right, and a white male on, the African-American on the left and the white male on the right. And these figures have their arms intertwined, but they're not interacting. And they have these kind of disconnected gazes, these very unemotional faces as they look out and confront us. And the black figure, he has his hand over his heart, which could be seen as an attempt to pledge allegiance, as well as kind of slow the bleeding from his chest wound. And this victim, he's holding a knife in his other hand that, he's armed to defend himself against future attacks. And then the white male that she shows him in this kind of dominant, aggressive stance that shows this kind of, power structure at the time and this kind of stubborn continuation of racial segregation that she felt continued during this time. So she was really concerned with the condition of race relations in the 60s and the kind of violent and chaotic events that were surrounding this. So she wanted to confront these issues with this painting. And this was part of a series, so multiple paintings that were confronting different issues that she saw. Another artist who's confronting racial issues is Fred Wilson. And he created this installation called Mining the Museum. And rather than creating new objects, what Wilson was doing was bringing objects together that were already in the world, but presenting them in the way that helps people see them in a new light. So he'd actually become fascinated with how museums and cultural institutions sometimes consciously or unwittingly kind of reinforce racist beliefs. He had worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an educator and really became interested in that during his time there. So he worked together with the Maryland Historical Society and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Maryland to create this installation. And he spent time at the Maryland Historical Society going through their collection and thinking about these kind of startling juxtapositions. So in this case, he takes this kind of delicate a baby carriage, and folds this Ku Klux Klan hood into the baby carriage. And he's suggesting this idea that racism is learned and sometimes even nurtured. In another juxtaposition on the right-hand side, this was in a section called Metalwork. He includes this fine silver tea set, and then includes slave shackles right in the middle. And then on the bottom left, this was in a section called Cabinetry. Here's these finely wrought chairs, and he moved them to face this whipping post. So he's, drawing, and these were all objects that were in the Maryland Historical Society's collection, but he's putting them together to draw attention to these, issues from the past, bring it to the present. And it's interesting. So he put this together in 1992. A week after the show opened, the violent riots erupted in LA surrounding the acquittal of the 4 LA police officers who had been acquitted in the beating of Rodney King. So it came at this very opportune time to kind of comment on these issues of race that still haunt the United States. Now, the next artist is Judy Chicago, and she was interested in thinking about issues of feminist issues. And, she was thinking about exploring, women's roles in the past, how they have been overlooked, looking at women from the past, historical women. Oh, gosh, sorry. And thinking about, what they have done. And she was really interested in this kind of lack of female representation in history books, in art museums, and she wanted to approach that. So she was an art professor and was interested in transforming education for women artists. She was especially interested in women working in a community, working in a collaborative environment rather than just as individuals. And in this massive installation piece, she tackled many of these issues. So this was called The Dinner Party. And the dinner party reflects, kind of women's traditional roles as homemakers, servers of food, makers of food. But here, women are the honored guests. So they are not the ones serving the food or making the food, but they are being celebrated and honored. Now, when she first kind of thought of this, she saw this as a kind of last supper for women. So it was originally going to be 13 women. But as she did her research, she came across all these women that she wanted to focus on. So she enlarged it to 39 guests. And she created this triangle formation, which she saw as a symbol of woman and of goddess. And she organized it chronologically. So on one side of the triangle, we begin with kind of these primordial goddesses from prehistory all the way to women from the Roman Empire. The next side of the triangle begins with women from early Christianity through the Reformation. And then the last side of the triangle begins with women from the American Revolution through women's rights. And some of the women that she included were Hatshepsut, who was the famous female pharaoh, Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a painter during the Baroque period, Georgia O'Keeffe, the modernist painter from New Mexico, Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's rights. So she included these women in this installation, in this kind of dinner party. So each guest had a table setting that included a runner that was embroidered, as well as this plate. And she used kind of abstract imagery, very kind of bold imagery to reflect something about the women that were being honored. Now, it's interesting that she's using china and tapestry. So again, these are materials typically associated with kind of women's work. But she's using, the style is very kind of bold and in your face, and she's interested in bringing this craft, this women's work, to the world of fine art. Now, I also mentioned this idea of collaboration. She did not work on this alone. Judy Chicago had a team of over 400 people that helped her with research, with the creation of these different pieces, the installation of it. So working together was very important to feminist artists. Now, some praised this. There was kind of mixed reaction to this. Some folks praised it for celebrating women from the past and bringing recognition to them. Others thought it kind of reduced women to their sexuality through the symbolism of the plates, and that women are more than that. So, but a really kind of seminal piece in focusing on women's issues. Now, location is another issue that artists during the second half of the 20th century have really thought about. And they're questioning, does art have to be just within the walls of a museum and gallery? Can it go outside of those walls? And here we have Robert Smithson, who takes art way outside of the museum setting. And he was creating earthworks. And this really grew out of this interest in the environment in the late 60s and 70s. And by kind of transforming the land, he's drawing attention to the environment. When you do something different to it, you see it in a new way. So this is created out in the Utah desert in the Great Salt Lake. And it's site-specific. This is for this one specific place. And when he was creating it, when he was coming up with the idea, he didn't want it to impose an unrelated form onto the landscape. So he wanted it to work on a kind of large level and then a smaller level as well. So he said that when he looked at the site, it suggested this kind of circular form. And then on a micro level, it reflects the kind of molecular structure of the salt crystals that form in the Great Salt Lake. Now, in creating this, he came up with the idea, but again, he's not actually making it with his hand. He hired a foreman and heavy machinery to create this 1,500 meter spiral of rocks and earth. Now, there's some inherent problems with taking work outside of the gallery walls. So, to see this, you have to be on site, and it helps to be above it to take in the full view. And so it's inaccessible to most people. It also changes over time as the lake rises and falls. So, there's some issues with these works going outside of the museum. Another artist who was also moving outside the museum was Keith Haring. And he was a graffiti artist and was, going out on the gritty streets or the subways of New York. And what he would do, he would find the black pieces of paper that were used by or to cover expired advertisements in the subway, and he would use that as his canvas, and he would draw on them with white chalk. And he included these images that he used over and over again. Sometimes there were flying saucers with beams of light, barking dogs, or another image that he included, androgynous people, these kind of composite figures that he included. And while his images were accessible to everybody riding the subways, he used them to communicate important kind of social and political ideas to a wide audience. So he commented on apartheid in South Africa and the abuse of crack cocaine and the AIDS epidemic that eventually took his own life. And, you know, his images and forms became something that commuters in New York City looked for. They were very recognizable. And he really saturated the market with them, creating them, you know, throughout the subway system. Eventually, his images appeared on posters. He created painted murals. And so they were really seen in many different places. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to finish up with two paintings from the 2000s. And I wanted us to think about how artists are kind of looking to the past and using it as a means to comment on issues in the present. So here we have these two paintings. On the right-hand side, this is by Heidi Wiley, and he creates these large-scale portrait paintings. And again, typically, these massive portraits were reserved for important people, like Napoleon that you see right here. These people with money and power, and they're idealized. They show how the person wants to be remembered. But Wiley really kind of undermines these traditions. So what he does in his process of creating these portraits, he invites strangers that he encounters on the street. So he sees somebody and he invites them into his studio for a portrait. And he asks them to look through these books of, you know, famous paintings and portraits and ask them to pick one. And he paints that individual in the same style and pose of that famous individual. So in this case, this man chose to be represented as Napoleon, and he's shown on this horse, you know, and the horse is galloping over the Alps, but he's shown, you know, with his baggy pants, his Timberland boots, his bandana around his head. So he's thinking about, you know, race and the politics of representing contemporary African-American men. He did a whole series on African-American men. And he's giving his subjects control in how they're portrayed. He's allowing them to choose how they want to be represented. And it's interesting, Wiley was chosen by Obama to paint his official portrait. So it'll be interesting to see how Obama chooses. And I think it'll be finished soon. And the final artist that I wanted to talk about is Mark Bradford. And he's also looking to the past. And this is a very recent work. It was installed in the Hirshhorn Museum in November 2017. And he is confronting the past and thinking about these events in the past and what it means to the present and the future. So he takes this installation that he created was, he was inspired by this 19th century cyclorama. And cycloramas were these paintings that were these large paintings. They would kind of take up the walls of an entire room. It was kind of like early IMAX before film, but it's supposed to be this immersive experience, and you could experience these events. So this cyclorama that he was inspired by showed Pickett's Charge, which was a really decisive moment in the Civil War. General Pickett was a Confederate leader and was a turning point in the Civil War and eventually American history. So he takes that cyclorama, reproductions of it, and transforms it. And here you can see a close-up of it. He almost creates, it's almost like this archaeological dig with these layers, and you can see the reproduction, but below that are layers of paper that he placed under it. He scrapes it down with a sandblaster and a blowtorch. There's 10 layers of colored paper. He cuts it and shreds it. He embedded ropes and cords into it. Sometimes he tore out pieces. You can see that on the right, kind of revealing what's underneath. And so he's transforming that original 19th century view that gives you this single point of view. And he's showing all of these different layers by cutting and scraping and transforming it. And he's revealing what's underneath, these kind of hidden complexities lurking beneath the surface. And so he's thinking about, how American history is written, how it's contested, and continues to impact us today. And this was really, he started this in 2015, but its installation came at a really kind of decisive moment. So if you remember back last year, there was a huge debate about the role of Confederate monuments and what these images from the past mean today. So it's a very kind of timely comment on the past and how, we're rethinking history and how it continues to impact us today. So I know I've gone very quickly and I have gone over our hour a little bit, but I've only scratched the surface and, just touched on a few of these kind of important themes and some of these kind of key players and themes in American art over the last 50 years. And I wanted us to come back to the Foothills Art Center. And, the Foothills Art Center's exhibitions have explored some of these themes. As I was kind of going through past exhibitions, I was looking at the exhibition that's coming up next, the Finding Home, about housing issues in Denver. So confronting social issues. This idea of questioning this divide between art and craft. I mean, there's been shows on textiles, the clay show, the fine craft invitational. There's been artists, exploring the environment with 3 scientists, 3 artists and forums, and then graffiti art with street funks and font. So, it's interesting to see how the Foothills Art Center is embracing, artists that are exploring these themes. And I wanted to end with this quote from Georgia O'Keeffe, and I love it. I think it really speaks to the future of art, and we don't know what's coming next. She said, "I realized I had things in my head, not like what I had been taught, not like what I had seen, shapes and ideas so familiar to me that it hadn't occurred to me to put them down. I decided to put away everything I had done and to start to say things that were my own." So, thinking about how artists can continue to express themselves and their ideas in unique ways. And the wonderful thing about, contemporary art is, how artists are transforming this world that we all live in and how they're giving us as viewers a kind of new perspective on the events that we experience, and we can see them from a new perspective. So that's all I have. If you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
I recently put up a Facebook